this week's video on a series looking at still life as our subject matter. This week I want to talk to you about the parts of form and how we see them as we get closer and further away from our subject matter. I'm going to be using words like umbras, humps, terminators, halftones, and they're good words to learn and to understand, because then when you're looking at something, you can be putting words to certain parts and recognizing those parts and understanding how those parts interact with the other parts that surround them. The other thing that I want to introduce to you this week is a little bit of the Meldrum method, which is that idea of observation from a fixed focusing point. And what I'm going to do in the exercise that you will do is look at the different parts of form that you can see from different fixed focusing points. One from very far away, one from a midpoint, and one somewhat closer. For this week's exercise, I want you to set yourself up with a strong single light source like I have done here. Also work with some subject matter that is simple to work with. Nothing overly ornate, particularly if you've not done something like this exercise before. And keep it, if possible, put it on some dark fabric and maybe raise it up a little bit like I have here. This is a shadow box that I've constructed out of MDF. It's just a base, a back and a side. You could easily tear up a cardboard box and make something just as suitable to what I've got here. This week's exercise I'm going to do is a drawing exercise again, but you could equally do this in paint, watercolour, oil, etc. Or with charcoal or any other medium. It's not a medium specific exercise, this one. As I'll be using a pencil in this exercise, I'll be using that same mark as what we used last week, that top and tailing, making marks all in the one direction. In this one exercise, I just used the one pencil though, compared to previous exercises where I was changing pencil, working from light to dark. And this time I'm only using a 6B. The 6B is a very useful all-rounder pencil. It's at a point that you can get reasonably and good darks, yet at the same time by using it very lightly, get easily, or relatively easy, lighter tones as well. So that could be a good challenge for you this week to maybe try, if you are going to attempt this exercise in pencil, to be just using the one single grade and trying to get that versatility of tones from one to the next. So in preparation for the exercise for the painters, painting a single object, I need to run you through the different parts that you're looking for that create form. So this is where we're talking about humps and reflected light and all of those things. So if we look at and think about how light falls on a sphere, we have the sphere and its cast shadow. Now remember, the cast shadow tells us as much about what's going on here within the object itself as anything that's going on here. They work in tandem. So if you've got a nice rounded cast shadow, it's telling you that this object is rounded, as opposed to, say for instance, with something that's cubic,
its shadow would be more cubic as well, have much straighter edges rather than the curved edges of this. The first key thing that we need to think about when we're looking at something is the chiaroscuro, the broad light and dark pattern, and that's the first thing that you'll be doing in the painting as to what you'd capture. So if our light source is coming from this side, the broad chiaroscuro of this sphere would have a line there that marks the point where the light and the dark meet. So this area here, so the cast shadow and the shadow part of the object would be dark, and this part would be light. And that's called the chiaroscuro, that light-dark pattern. It's where you have to decide either things are light or dark. This line on the object itself that defines where the light and the dark meet has a name, and we call that the terminator. And that's that where the light terminates and becomes dark, or back the other way, where the dark terminates and becomes light. Now, each of these three parts, we can think about dividing them up into further 3 more parts. So the light has 3 parts, the shadow or the dark of the object has 3 parts, and the cast shadow will have 3 parts as well. When you're looking here in the light, you've got that bright highlight, which is the brightest and the lightest part of this half of the object. So that's the highlight. And it will be the light. That then identifies the next, and this is probably the hardest bit to see, which is what we call the light. Now it's this area surrounding the highlight here. And that we call the light. And it will be the mid-tone of that part. And then here, the last part is the half tone. And it will be the dark of that part. Here in the dark side, we have 3 parts again. So the darkest part will be an area here, just beyond the terminator, and that is called the hump. And that will be the darkest part. This is the darkest part of the form, so no other area on the object itself will be darker than this, but there is an area that is darker again that we'll come to in a moment. The rest of here is called the dark, or the shadow, and that is the mid-toned part of this part of the form. The last part is this area down in here, which is the reflected light. Which will be the lightest part of this form. The interesting thing when you're coming and looking at this is that often the reflected light and the half tone here are the same tone. They are often a linking tone from one part to the other, so that creates cohesion in the whole if you have tones like that that link across the form. The last part here is in the cast shadow. So the cast shadow has 3 parts. The main part of the cast shadow is the penumbra, and it is the mid-toned part. We sometimes see, and you don't always see this, it depends on the strength of the light source here, an area of tone like that, that's an inversion of the cast shadow. And that's called an antumbra, but as I said before, you don't see that one very often. And the last part will be a dark area down in here under, and that is the umbra, and that will be the darkest tone. This is then also, the umbra will be the darkest tone in the whole as well. So remembering I said before, the hump is the darkest part of the form on the object itself, but the umbra is the darkest part of the whole when we talk about the reflected, when we talk about the cast shadow in relation to the object itself. So the umbra, and again, often you find the penumbra is a similar tone to, say, the hump, and is a linking across like that. So there's this repetition of the tones in each of these parts. One thing I'll note is that here within a cube there are all these parts as well. So in a similar light source we'd probably talk about the top there being the light, or probably actually the side here being the light. This side would have a halftone. This would be the dark, which would have a hump, reflected light down in here, and then an umbra into a penumbra. There's the light, and there probably would be a highlight along an edge or somewhere along here. So that has all the same parts. The one thing to note between these two, and these are the two extremes, is the quick transitions between each of these parts. They're sharp, and sharpness equals a cubic form. In a sphere, and if I quickly just draw down here a version of this, thinking about all these parts, what I'm looking for to create something spherical is a gentle transition from one to the next part. If I make the transitions too great, they lose that gentleness. Probably the sharpest would be there in the hump, in the umbra. There's the hump going in. See the reflected light appear. We'll take out the highlight. We'll take out the light, I should say, first. And then take out a highlight. I'll just darken that light up ever so slightly. So there you can see those transitions in action, and how that gentle transition gives a feeling of roundness. So gentle transitions equals roundness.
So once you have your setup worked out with a single light source, as I mentioned, and raised a little bit if you can, I want you to stand back about 10 paces from it and look at it at this fixed focusing point with your sketchbook in hand, and draw what you see in terms of light and dark from that position. From about 10 paces away, you should see something maybe along the lines of this, that it is just a light and dark. Don't try to strain your eyes too much. The more you try and strain your eyes, you may start to see other parts that are darker or lighter. If anything, squint slightly and see what happens. If you squint slightly from 10 paces away, it should just appear as a light and a dark disturbance, which when we were thinking about the parts of form, when we were looking before, was that I began with the light side of the sphere and the dark side of the sphere as being the first major masses that were the form. Now take 3 paces closer to your subject matter and set yourself up at that position, ready to draw. From those few paces closer, you may be able to start to see some differences now within that light and dark mass. You might be able to see within the dark mass some areas that are darker, and within the light mass you may notice some areas that are darker as well. What we're now starting to see is the halftone in the light mass, and we're starting to see the humps that are in the dark mass. So we're working now to, maybe 4 different tones, whereas our previous drawing we were simply at 2. And again, take another 3 paces towards your subject matter and set yourself up again, ready to draw. From this position, you are now starting to see a lot more of the parts that we described before when looking at form. Within the dark half, we're now starting to see reflected lights, the dark and the humps. And within the light, the halftones, the light and the highlights. We may also start to see umbras and penumbras as that cast shadow starts to fall into its lighter and darker parts. The final part of this exercise that I've waited until now to reveal to you is the idea of drawing sight size, drawing the object as big as you see it from the position that you are at. So you can see here in my sketchbook, up the very top there, is my drawing of the jug from 10 paces away. That one in the middle is now 3 paces closer, and so it starts to get bigger. And then that last one, another 3 paces closer, and it's bigger again. But each time I was trying to draw the jug as closely as I could to the size that I saw it from the position that I was placed at. As always, good luck, and I look forward to seeing your results this week.